defamation laws, of secrecy laws to punish both whistleblowers and journalists. And these are all, again, so these two groups of issues, I think, can be difficult, can be more difficult for us to counter because they're more difficult to expose. They're not as obvious. You know, it's very obvious what's happening in Turkey. We can see it. We see that there are journalists in prison. It's loud. It's extreme. The killings in Malta and Slovakia, the same. And these sorts of issues, as I say, can sometimes take place without our knowing about them. And they're more difficult to define. They're slipperier, and therefore more difficult to expose and counter. And those are the kinds of things that we're going to talk about today with our fantastic panelists that I'm just going to introduce briefly. We have first to my left Edouard Perrin, who is a well-known investigative journalist, and I think became very well known in Europe around the LuxLeaks investigation, which was based on material from a whistleblower. And I'm sure that many of you know Edouard was the focus of criminal charges in relation to this investigation, among other things, for theft and for breach of secrets, and faced at one point 10 years in prison before being acquitted by a court in Luxembourg. Now working with an organization called Première Ligne, which is a TV and press agency producing investigative documentaries. Then we have Mary Fitzgerald, who is the editor-in-chief of Open Democracy, which describes itself as a global nonprofit media outlet that seeks to challenge power and inspire change through tenacious reporting, thoughtful analysis, and democratic debate. You founded Open Democracy in 2001. And what's going to be really interesting today is to hear you talk about the current survey you have ongoing about commercial pressure on media outlets. Yes, next we have Francois Tolkien, Dr. Francois Tolkien, who is a former judge at the European Court of Human Rights. She was at the court from 1998 to September 2012, and she served as vice president of the court starting in February 2011, excuse me. She's been a professor at the University of Louvain, and her expertise in general has to do with criminal law and human rights law. And finally, last but not least, from Hungary, we have András Desi, who for almost 3 decades worked at the Hungarian daily Népszabadság, which I'm sure many of you know was forcibly closed in 2016 under controversial circumstances that I'm sure we'll hear more about. Now today he's working as a freelance author and journalist, continuing to follow press freedom developments in Hungary. And I'd actually like to start with András today, because I think that in a way Hungary is emblematic of this type of soft censorship or sort of system-based censorship that's operating in the background in ways that are not always obvious to the naked eye and in ways that are difficult to research. So I wonder if you could start us off by talking about your own experience at Népszabadság, how you experienced this system, what led to the closure, and maybe a little bit about how this system of censorship is functioning today in Hungary.
Scott, thank you very much for the kind words and for introducing my humble person, and thank you very much for inviting me to this event. I'm honored to be here. I was wondering, and I was thinking whether the title "Killing Me Softly" does it make any sense, any application for my case, not for my case, but for the case of Népszabadság, which was shut down or assassinated or murdered overnight. And it happened very quick and very brutally. So I'm still alive, and hopefully all my fellow colleagues are still alive, and most of them found jobs in the Hungarian press. But the shock, it was, we felt betrayed. We felt shocked that we, so on Friday night in October, back 2016, you are leaving the editorial room, and and you are thinking about that Sunday you are going to meet your fellow colleagues again, and you are going to make a newspaper for Monday. And the other day in the morning, you learn from the internet that the newspaper, which was the #1 daily newspaper in Hungary, a newspaper of reference and international recognition, was shut down, was suspended. So it was humiliating. You asked me about censorship in Hungary. I would not apply the word censorship. And the situation is not so bad as in Russia or in Ukraine or in Turkey or in Slovakia or in Malta, where journalists are murdered or journalists are jailed or prosecuted. In Hungary, I would say that there's a constant media war since the political changes back in 1989-90. And this media war started with the fight that who is going to control the so-called public TV and public radio. At that time, there was no internet, there was no commercial TV stations. The main source of information was public TV and radio. And since that, politics is dominating the Hungarian media landscape, and political parties try to have their own influence on the media. What changed since I would say since 2002, since that year that Viktor Orban lost the elections, that he really realized that he didn't have the media support for the re-election, and he made the conclusion that if you don't have the media support, you don't have to create a media support for you. And from that point on, he and Fidesz and people close to him and businessmen close to him, they are creating a media empire for them. So, and what we see in the recent years in Hungary, this is basically I would call it a capitalist restructuration, that businessmen with close ties to the government, they are taking over, they are acquiring media outlets. And they have a large portfolio. They control the so-called public TV, public radio. They have political daily newspapers, political magazines, weekly magazines, the tabloid press, internet, everything. So they are dominating. The media landscape, which is still very diverse and very colorful. So if you go on the internet, or if you go to the newsstand in Budapest, Hungary, you see a large scale of different newspapers and magazines. So you still have the choice, but the domination is very strong. And one more thing I'd like to add, that the advertising market is dominated by them. First of all, by the state, because in Hungary there is no more advertising market anymore. The state-owned companies, they are the biggest advertisers, and the companies, the private companies, they watch. Basically, they watch the state lottery company. So the state lottery company is the indicator for that. Where are the safe places where you can put your advertising without having political consequences or political backlash on you? So if the state lottery company is putting advertising in a magazine or in an internet website, so it shows that it's a safe place, and commercial companies can follow.
You mentioned when you were describing the system that people have a choice, and that there's still a diverse media landscape in Hungary in principle. To what extent is the public aware of these sort of networks of ownership, for example, that the Fidesz party has used to, as you described it, kind of ensure that the media is providing or a chunk of the media is providing friendly coverage. Are people aware of that, and does it make a difference?
So it makes a difference. So it makes a difference whether you ask people in Budapest or in the big cities or in the countryside, because the countryside is absolutely dominated by the government-friendly or pro-government press. The regional daily newspapers, all regional daily newspapers, are owned by people who have close ties with Fidesz, with the ruling party. Let me give you an example. On April 8th, we had parliamentary elections in Hungary, and on April 7th, on a Saturday, all regional daily newspapers, they are 18 daily newspapers. They have run on the front page the same interview with Prime Minister Orbán. So there is no difference between among this publication. They use the same photos, the same material, the same text. So this is what I'm calling domination. So there are, I think, the limited number of people who know that, and unfortunately, the situation is getting worse and worse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed. Right after the election, another big newspaper, Magyar Nemzet, was closed, which was also owned by a former ally of Prime Minister Orbán, and a number of other media outlets owned by this same former ally, now also under pressure. How decisive was this recent election for media freedom in Hungary?
So first of all, the closure or the suspension of this other newspaper is a tragic loss. And it's a loss because this newspaper, as my newspapers, we belong to the cultural heritage of our country, and you can substitute that. And I think that after the supermajority, so after the supermajority, what Fidesz secured again on April 8th, there will be much more pressure on the media. They want to control more and more media outlets, and the rumor is that they want to take over the businessmen with close ties with Fidesz. They want to take over the biggest commercial TV station, RTL Club, which is owned by the German media giant Bertelsmann, and they would like to take over the biggest internet website, Index. So I think that they have money, they have the power. It depends on the current owners whether they would sell these media outlets if they are approached.
Yeah, very interesting. And I remember, for example, talking about this question of foreign owners standing, and maybe we can come back to it later, but past examples, I think, haven't been so positive in that sense. There have been media outlets that were owned by foreign owners, for example, Origo, which was owned by Telecom, and sold eventually to a government-friendly businessman and is now very close to the Orban line.
Yeah, so basically foreign owners have left the Hungarian market. And I have to say that the current conditions under the foreign owners have not been better. So they haven't put too much money in this venture, but they squeeze the journalists and they try to make more and more and profits. And I think that it doesn't make a big difference whether the owner is foreigner or Hungarian. It depends on the fact whether the owner believes in freedom of the press and believes in these values, or considers or the owner is considering this venture as a pure capitalistic venture that he wants to put money in and he wants to take much more money from that.
Thanks a lot. Very interesting and yeah, a little bit pessimistic,
Yeah,
I guess,
I'm-
about the
I am
current situation.
pessimistic, unfortunately.
Understandably. Yeah, I'd like to turn to Mary now. As I mentioned, you're the editor-in-chief of Open Democracy, and kind of staying on this topic of sort of commercial pressure, financial pressure on media outlets. As I mentioned at the beginning, or Open Democracy is running a big survey, a big investigation into commercial pressure in newsrooms. So maybe it would be great if you can sort of tell us about that survey. How does it work? What are you trying to find out? And why are you trying to find out about this?
Thank you. I think I will start by explaining why we're running this survey. We're a global news outlet, but this story is based in London and it threads across Europe. So I didn't start Open Democracy in 2001 because I was still in college.
My bad.
But since 2001, Open Democracy has been publishing the voices, the perspectives, the argument, the challenge that others won't, for whatever reason. And for a long time, we were publishing a very well-known journalist in the UK called Peter Oborne, who is a conservative political commentator and was one of the best-known and best-paid journalists working for the Daily Telegraph, which is one of the biggest right-leaning papers in the UK. And he'd been trying for a long time. He'd been looking at the global banking giant HSBC, and he'd been uncovering all these stories and producing them for the Telegraph, and they kept on getting spiked at the last minute. They kept on not being published. And he was a bit confused about this at first. He brought some of them to us. One of them was about how HSBC had been shutting the bank accounts of prominent Muslim charities that were involved in the Gaza relief effort, and other sort of embarrassing things about HSBC. Turns out that this wasn't a coincidence that all these stories were being spiked. And that actually what was going on was that HSBC was one of the Telegraph's biggest advertisers. And as one unnamed executive put it, they are the advertiser who you cannot afford to offend. So it turns out there had also been a big investigation into HSBC's offshore activity for private clients that had been shut down by the Telegraph owners' personal lawyers back in 2012, who also happened to have all their assets based offshore. And Peter eventually, because he's a very principled, brave journalist, decided he had enough. So not only did he resign, but he went public, and he went public with a 3,000-word resignation letter on Open Democracy, talking about exactly what he discovered, and he did it the week of Swiss leaks, which was the big expose that ICIJ and affiliates blew up about HSBC's activities in Switzerland, and the authorities were raiding the bank's offices that very week. So the story was massive because it was an example of a very important public interest story being silenced in a country that is supposed to have a free press by a newspaper of good standing and good reputation. But Peter is an unusual case. There are plenty of brave journalists, there are plenty of brave whistleblowers, but he was in a position where he was financially independent because he was one of the country's best-known journalists. He didn't have to, he wasn't looking at his paycheck at the end of every week. He knew that he would be able to work elsewhere because his name had enough brand recognition. Most journalists are not in this situation, even in countries with supposedly free press, right? You don't shop your employer, as they say, because you worry that you'll never work again, and you worry also because the news industry is in the state that it's in now. Even in countries where you don't have Viktor Orban, where just a collapse in advertising revenue and the business model has meant it's very, very hard for the industry to survive. So you don't want to do anything that's going to further damage the reputation of your own industry. So it's both, your job being on the line and the sort of broader worries about the sustainability of news that makes it very hard for journalists to speak out about these kind of stories. But lots of people came to us after Peter did that big story and said, you don't know the half of it. This is what's happening here. This is what's happening here. This is what's happening here. Of course, it was very hard to get anybody to go on the record. So we designed a project which would allow journalists to tell us what they knew anonymously. There's a survey that we're running now. If you go to opendemocracy.net/open media, or just Google open media and open democracy, you'll see the survey that we're running. We're still collecting responses. You can reply completely anonymously to the survey, and it asks a series of questions about whether working journalists have experienced commercial interference. We're collecting that survey data. We're also working with Index on Censorship, who have a project called Mapping Media Freedom, and you can report instances of commercial interference through that channel. And you can also report instances to us directly. We have secure channels for people to tell us things and leak documents. The picture that's emerging from that so far, I should add also that the Reporters Without Borders and the EFJ are involved in this project in disseminating the survey. But the picture we're finding so far is interesting. Firstly, everybody chooses to reply anonymously, which makes it a useful service in terms of collecting metadata about the state of the industry, but doesn't give us very many actionable leads in terms of standing up stories about this type of interference. So some of our best leads have been through our own networks, through journalists who we know personally, where there's a personal connection. One story that came through this channel was around a theme which has come up a lot in our survey and in our research, which is not that necessarily, there are obviously cases where advertisers or owners or shareholders or whoever gets involved and says, you can't write this story, or you should write this story, you should write a particular way, you should be nice about this company, you should not be nasty about this company. But also where sponsored content or native advertising is not properly labeled. I think you'd have to have a degree in media literacy to notice, if you're scrolling on your phone, what is sponsored content and what isn't. If you're a 16-year-old on social media, you might be even less likely to spot this. It's everywhere. And it's one of the only lifelines left for the industry in terms of revenue. It's all over the place. And increasingly, not only is it poorly labeled, it's not labeled at all. So you genuinely do not know who's paying for your news. If news is free, who's paying for it? It's not free to produce. And a story which illustrated this, which came out of our project, was about a newspaper called the London Evening Standard. The London Evening Standard is distributed freely across the United Kingdom in cities. It's a free sheet, so it goes to millions of people every week. And it's edited by the former Finance Minister of the UK, George Osborne, who had quite a hand in failing to win the Brexit referendum, but that's a different story. The London Evening Standard, over a series of months, published a series of articles about how genetically modified food, GMOs, and GMO technology was going to solve all the world's hunger problems, which is great news, right? Everyone's happy to hear that. Phew, there's going to be no more world hunger. Turns out that all these articles were paid for by Syngenta, which is one of the biggest agribusiness companies in the entire world, and which in particular is lobbying and spending a ton of money on lobbying for more permissive, more relaxed rules on GMOs in Britain post-Brexit. So, they want these EU regulations about GMOs to just be chucked to one side as soon as the United Kingdom leaves the European Union, and they're spending a lot of money trying to make that happen. So, as part of their PR advocacy plan, they paid the London Evening Standard a lot of money for the London Evening Standard, not very much for Syngenta, to publish all this wonderful stuff about how this technology was going to, save the world and change lives. And it wasn't even labeled at all. It wasn't that there was some sort of very small disclaimer in the bottom corner. It just wasn't labeled. It was just called news. And this was fed to millions of Londoners who were commuting to and from, to work every day. This is one example. This is one particularly egregious example of this happening. But again, it's happening across the sector. So I think that, I suppose to summarize, and we're going to be publishing more stories on this theme, so please watch this space. We've got a lot more in the pipeline. I suppose to summarize, what we found so far is, perhaps unsurprisingly, a fear and resistance to telling these stories about our own industry and about our own working practices amongst journalists. It's very different in countries. We've had respondents from countries, from people in Turkey and Russia and Poland and Hungary, where the situation is different because it's more overtly state-directed, Whereas I think in cases like in the UK, it's not so much state directed; it's big business directed. It's sort of global business interests that are. But the mechanism is the same. It's the same lever. It's money being used as a lever to exert power over what is and is not published, how stories are framed, who they reach, how they reach them. And I think it's just, it's part of the same spectrum of a really pernicious, dangerous threat to press freedom. I'll say one more thing, which is this. If you speak to any working journalist about a story, the stories they're most proud of doing, it's a story where something changed as a result of them publishing the story. We were talking earlier about there being a big separation between journalism and activism, and journalists don't like to see themselves as activists and don't think that necessarily they should be advocates for their story. And yet the motivating factor for most people going into journalism, and the thing that makes them most proud about being journalists, is their ability to have a positive effect out there in the world. And I think the business structure that's now being imposed or is developing around journalism is kind of getting in the way of restricting this noble instinct that I think most working journalists have. Most working journalists know what stories are in the public interest and how to tell them. And I feel that first of all, the business model is having a very negative effect on that instinct and that skill and that knowledge. And it's also meaning that there's a new generation of media businesses and journalists out there for whom those skills and those principles are not as well defined or well grounded. I'm not somebody who says, it was all better in the old days and young journalists don't know how to do anything. I think there's plenty of important skills that are coming out in new media, and they're the future of media. But something of a journalist's freedom to report on stories which are in the public interest in a way which is in the public interest is being softly squashed or silenced by the business model we have at play at the moment. So that's what our project is drawing attention to. And please check out Open Media and pass the survey around to anybody you know and fill it out if there's anything you'd like to share with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think the Evening Standard is a very illustrative example and
shameless.
Shameless. Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I wanted to ask you this as a follow-up. This is one example of an attempt to manipulate public opinion. Probably you'll come up with others. What do you hope to achieve by showing that this is going on, or what do you expect can be an outcome of showing the public that this is happening on a regular basis?
That's a really good question, because the last thing we want to do is kick the industry when it's down. And it's very easy for our stories to be framed that way, to generate even more cynicism about the business of journalism, which is not what we want to do. We want to make a positive case for doing journalism well, and for readers funding it, and for demanding transparency and accountability from publishers. I think that, if done well, if these stories are told well, they can help push for and incentivize better transparency and accountability amongst publishers. In countries where it's just commercial pressure, when you have political and commercial pressure, it's far harder. But in countries where it's mainly the commercial pressure, there are two ways that you can influence this. The first is that, you could perhaps encourage readers to demand. So one of the tools we're developing is a little plugin which allows readers to sort of tweet or label or tweet what, if they think something is sponsored content that's not been labeled, and tweet at the publishers to say, hey, hang on a minute, who paid for this? And I think only when only when you drive demand from that side as well, are you going to affect any kind of positive change and better transparency and accountability. It comes top down as well. It can come through regulation. It can come through policy measures. It can come through industry guidelines, and those things have their play. I mean, the role of regulation can be debated forever, and it's problematic. But it can come from within the industry, but it's only really going to come from within the industry if it also comes from outside of the industry on the demand levers as well. So that's what we're hoping to do, is to frame these stories in a way of, this is what's good about journalism. This is what's not happening now. This is what needs to change.
Thanks very much. Okay, let's turn to Edward now. Again, I think his story is certainly known to some of you, your role in the LuxLeaks investigation, and as I mentioned at the beginning, the fact that you faced these criminal charges, you were acquitted, although the source had to go all the way to the Court of Cassation in Luxembourg to have his sentence overturned. Maybe if you can just sort of describe how this happened, your experience being the target of these charges for doing your job, for doing your work of informing the public about an issue of public interest. I think we can all agree. And what impact that experience has had on you now, to the extent that it's affected the way or changed the way that you approach your work.
Thank you for having me here. I should mention as an introduction that I always worked for the public television in France, and for me it was a career choice because public television is poorly paid compared to the competition. But that was I knew I could do stories on the public television that I wouldn't do definitely on the private networks. I spent some years behind the camera, and then I started investigating myself for different programs, and then I was hired when small production and press agency was commissioned by the first public network France to do a new investigative documentary program, business focused, in 2011, and this is important because that's when I started looking into not Luxembourg, but taxation and multinationals, a topic about which I didn't know anything at the time. I got in touch with my first source. Everybody knows now. I mean, that's the issue with this story. Everything is known about sources in my case, so I can talk about them without any problems anymore, unfortunately. The first source was Antoine Deltour. He was an auditor at PricewaterhouseCoopers and left for mostly ethical reasons to go and work somewhere else. And when he left with quite some documents. To make the story short, I got in touch with Antoine, and he transmitted the documents to me. I did the first story in 2012, and then after the first story I was contacted by yet another source. At the time I didn't know whether it was a source or a mole from the company. I was really careful about that. It turned out to be a second source with more documents. That led to a second story, 2013. And in 2014, end of 2014, we published LuxLeaks investigation along with quite a number of media outlets in Europe and elsewhere on the planet. All the while, but I didn't know about all of them, but all the while investigations were already running on the part of Luxembourg's authorities and PricewaterhouseCoopers, and I shall underline the fact that I wouldn't make any difference between the private investigation and the public prosecution, because they were forming one and only one investigation. To the point when I met the judge in Luxembourg, the judge couldn't find a piece in the binders she had in front of her and the lawyers from PwC that were present during the interrogation. Another really interesting Luxembourgish way to do things. The lawyers went around the desk of the judge and helped the judge to find the piece, which was, flabbergasting even for a French person. So there was this so-called public investigation, mostly mostly initiated by the forensic investigation from PwC, and started in 2012. We discovered that they very quickly discovered the first source, Antoine Deltour. They requested the French authorities to raid Antoine Deltour. It failed on a first trial, and it took 2 years basically for the French to go and raid Antoine Deltour's house, and that was in 2014 during the summer. The chronology is important because it will show you how it's evolved very quickly. Then November 2014, LuxLeaks breaks out, and obviously for PwC it's a really bad event because not only they see the documents that they identified coming from Deltour are out there, but they also identified documents that are posterior to the departure of Antoine Deltour, and hence there is a second source within the company. And this time they're going to use, and that's very interesting for this debate, they're going to use another tool in order to achieve their aim, which was to stop the leak, identify not only the leak, but the persons that were the recipients of that leak. They managed to have the house of my second source raided, not through criminal judge and criminal investigation in France. They went through civil judge in France, and they said, listen, we think we have a leak, and here is the name of the person. They wrote my name in it, saying that I had played this central role in the investigation. And they had a bailiff and two French officers go to the house of the source and basically took the computers away without having any judge looking, I mean, criminal judge or sitting judge looking at whether or not it was okay to do so. It was interesting because it was successful. They were able to access the correspondence of Raphaël Allais, the second source. They were able to pinpoint the relationship between him and me. And that led to him being charged in Luxembourg and me being charged as well, because they said at the time that I was either the person responsible for theft or an accomplice, and that's why I was charged and finally acquitted. But the two sources had to go all the way through the equivalent of the High Court in Luxembourg in order to try to see this through. Antoine Deltour was finally recognized as a whistleblower. It should be said because we have someone from the European Court of Human Rights, which I really thank, because we heard a lot about the convention, and being in court is really useful. That's when you really like Article 10. But Raphaël Allais, the second source, will have to go to Strasbourg because he was not deemed a whistleblower because, I mean, to sum it up, he didn't give me enough documents. So that was kind of another interesting legal opinion. Not sure how I shall construe this as a reporter, but just the personal experience of having PwCs, I mean, it's big. I mean, and they do have lawyers, quite a few. I was working for a public network. I was not alone. I did not have to pay my legal fees at all. My companies, both the network and my production company, paid them. It still is really, I wouldn't say intimidating, but makes you really think about what you wrote, how you approached the source, what kind of a language you used. Fortunately for me, I was apparently overly cautious, and that was something that the Luxembourg judges and prosecutors had a problem with, that I was too cautious, and I took precautions that they didn't understand, or they said it was conspirative. But anyway, My part was, I mean, on my opinion, I was just trying to protect the source. Still, I'm not looking at my job the same way now. I will be even more cautious because you know that whether or not what you do is proper or even interesting, but you do it right, even though you know that you took all the precautions, you know you'll have people in front of you that will take every single element possible to attack you, even though they're going to drop charges later on, and it will cost a huge amount of money. And that is, to go back to the topic of this afternoon, this is another soft censorship, because you'll always think about, even yourself, what if? Am I really sure I'm going down that road? Because what if? And then you've got your editor, what if? And then you've got the boss. And even for a public network, it's, well, what if this happens? So we're still doing the stories, fortunately, and we did the Panama Papers, we did the Paradise Papers, and we did, I mean, colleagues went and, I mean, only public service television can do, but yeah, it's a real, as we say in French, épée de Damoclès, you know, swords over, and it's going to be even more difficult because maybe we'll talk about this later on, but and that's when we go to the advocacy side that a few years ago I would have said, well, I'm just a journalist, I don't want to advocate for anything, but we had to fight legislation over trade secrets protection in France. We fought along many others in Brussels to have the Trade Secrets Directive amended and to make sure that we reporters and also sources and whistleblowers and researchers and union members would not have problems, or not too many problems with that. And we right now are fighting to have the transposition of this directive done in the most restrictive way in France, because, I mean, trade secrets are going to be a huge new weapon against the stories we will like to publish. And again, it's not whether you are right or wrong, it's just the fact that the tool exists to go to court and make you lose a lot of time, your company lose a lot of money that most of the time they don't have that much, and this is dangerous. It's just one of the many judicial and legal tools that are used, especially in business-oriented stories, but not only.
Just a quick, I mean, were you surprised that the charges were brought against you? I mean, when you were working on the investigation, did you think to yourself, everything I'm doing is, you know, what a journalist should be doing. I'm reporting on an important topic. I've got information from the source. Did you think while you were doing the investigation, there's something wrong, that you could get into legal trouble with what you were doing, or did you assume that you would be fine because what you were doing is at the heart of what journalists should be doing?
It didn't occur to me that way. I mean, I went to great, length to protect both of my sources. When I heard about Antoine Deltour's trouble, we immediately convened with him and the persons that would then defend him later on. It was all about the sources. I couldn't picture. I mean, it didn't occur to me that that it would go that way. I learned through the press that second person had been arrested. That was at the end of 2014, and the irony of it is it's not funny at all, is that in early 2015, when charges were brought against Raphaël Allais and then charges were brought against me, the attacks on Charlie Hebdo occurred, and we shared offices. We are in the same building that Charlie Hebdo's were, so we shared the same floor. We shared the same restrooms, and needless to say, it was. What happened that day really changed everybody, and myself included. And I had nothing in. Really, I completely lost track with LuxLeaks. And in fact, the nice letter from this judge in Luxembourg, was the first one was lost because all the mail, for some security reason for the building, would go to a newspaper in Paris that was taking the mail from Charlie Hebdo, and my summon from the judge went to Charlie Hebdo and came back weeks later. So the judge had to write another one and send it because it was not sent registered. So they wanted the cheap that time, and she had to resend it. And I learned it really late because of this ironical twist. It was some kind of a surprise receiving this, and even more surprise when I knew what charges and for what reason I was there. But that's another story.
Thank you very much. All right. Last but not least, Francois, as mentioned before, you spent many, many years on the European Court of Human Rights, and I'm sure that you have also a very interesting perspective on the case that we've just heard about. Also, probably important to mention that you chaired the Committee of Experts on Protection of Journalism and Safety of Journalists at the Council of Europe. So I think we're really interested to hear from you. How strong are protection mechanisms for the rights of journalists in Europe at the moment?
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for this initiative. For me, it's very, very important. And as you said, I will speak from the lens and through the lens of the human rights, be it in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, in Europe, the Convention of Human Rights, and also the Charter of Fundamental Rights, 2000, in Africa, the Africa Charter of Human Rights, in America, the Inter-American Convention of Human Rights. Freedom of expression is a fundamental right. It's a fundamental right, and for me, maybe the most important one. I put the emphasis on that. Why? Because then people say today, well, it's a luxury, we are in time of crisis, so freedom of expression is no, not at all. Not at all. For me, it's really one of the most fundamental human rights. And why? Because freedom of expression is really the foundation of a democratic society. And a democratic society is, by essence, a pluralistic society. So freedom of expression is going to the root of the democratic society. And as I said before, today, freedom of expression and democracy is a fragile institution. And we realize that freedom of expression and democracy as well, as we can observe that all over the world, is a very fragile institution. So we have to fight every day, otherwise we risk losing it. That's for me quite important from the very beginning to say that freedom of expression is really the fundamental of the democratic society. And I think democratic society so far is really the system that we have to favor. Therefore, there is of course a legal obligation, and I will limit myself to that because I'm unable to do something else. But there is not only a legal obligation. For me, there is also a social obligation, a political obligation, and even ethical and a moral obligation to respect and to protect and to develop freedom of expression. So, of course, we can rely on law, and that's exactly what I did at the court. But don't forget that it's not enough. Law is not the end in itself. We have also to develop a culture of respect of freedom of expression, and which, of course, take into play moral, social, political obligation. If you don't have that, the rest will be of no effect. So that's my first point, in order to put freedom of expression in its context which really explains the whole thing. It's not a droit bourgeois as something. No, it's not a droit bourgeois. It's really foundation of democracy. Alors today, I really was impressed by experience, your experience. I realize, and we realize at the court and in this committee, that freedom of expression is at risk. It's at risk, and there are really alarming situations. And what you have said, what you have explained for me was exactly what I listened there during this time at the committee. Unfortunately, yes, the freedom of expression is really at risk. Not only at risk, not only, I cannot say that, murder, harassment, physically injured, all these things are really unacceptable. And I think we have to put the emphasis on that. We cannot accept that people doing their job full stop are on such a position and their life is at risk. But at the same time, and I fully agree with that, there is also a soft censorship. And then we have to take into consideration both, I should say strong and soft, because all of them, all the situation of the press today, maybe it was the same before that, I don't know, it's not a question of historical, but today it's sure that the freedom of expression is really at risk for the person of the journalist and for the system in itself. I just would like to add something, and I don't know if there's a reality. When we were in this committee, some witness put the emphasis on the fact that the gender was really a problem also in that. And so I just put that for your attention. Some people, some witnesses say journalist and media actor, because journalist is not the only target, also media actor. Media actor means all people, you, me, everybody, who fulfill a public interest function, a public watchdog function, can be involved, can be implied in the journalist. So some people witness that journalists and other media actors are often specially targeted on account of their gender. I don't know if the gender identity is really, but I think so. So we are very, very cautious, and for us it was very important to take into account the specific experience of female journalists and other female media actors, of course, because they seem to the group that they face specific gender-related dangers, sexism, misogynies, degrading abuse. So I think that should be taken maybe into consideration. In any event, in any case, all this alarming situation had an effect, and the effect is a grave, chilling effect on freedom of expression. All this situation is really devastating for freedom of expression, because if there is a chilling effect, of course, people do prefer to keep silence. That's why the title of this table ronde is really excellent, Silencing Critical Voice. Alors, what to do? What to do on a pure legal point of view? Well, of course, we have Article 10 of the Convention. Okay, that's when everything has been exhausted in the domestic remedy, people, journalists, media actors can lodge a complaint to the court. But of course, that's at the end of the process. And we have to think also the beginning of the process. And that's why, for me, it was interesting, after having worked at the court, having seen the result of that, to examine more in advance what should be done. So maybe I would prefer to start with the recommendation. This famous recommendation, I say it is famous, not so famous. It's a recommendation of the Council of Europe and the Committee of Ministers. What is interesting in the recommendation is that they express the view of 47 member states. It means that in Europe now, today, when 47 member states accept this recommendation of the Committee of Ministers, it means, theoretically, I know that the implementation is difficult, it means that these 47 countries are invited, I shouldn't say obliged, but are invited to implement this recommendation into the domestic law. And so I think it's so important that we be very, very critical and very attentive, very cautious in all the different countries, these 47 countries, all Europe except Belarus and Vatican. That's the only country which are left, because Vatican is not a democratic country, as we know. So all Europe is, and Belarus, that's another situation. So all these countries are supposed to integrate into domestic law that, and each of us in our different country, we have to to push the people, and I should say the politicians, to do that. That's the problem, because otherwise it's really a chiffon de papier. How do you say that in English? That I don't know, but it's just illusory. Alors, this recommendation I will not go. And now, yes, why do I say that? Because now the recommendation was 2016. Now we are 2018. And of course, the situation is degrading. The situation is worse today, unfortunately, than in 2016. So I read 2 weeks ago that there is a document from the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe for develop an implementation strategy of this recommendation. And then they ask member states to say which is the priority among the measures proposed and which are the good practice to follow. That's important. So if you have some contact in your country, you have to ask your country, you have to ask your government to say which are the priority and which are the best practice. So I will not go in depth into this recommendation, but just to explain, I should say, its philosophy. And its philosophy, it's to develop guidelines articulated around 3 pillars. The first pillar is prevention. And for me, since of course I work in the judiciary, so at the end in the prosecution, but I am convinced that prevention is absolutely indispensable. It's useless, it's illusory to think that at the end of the process you will gain something if you don't have a holistic view of the system and of the problem. So prevention in this situation is absolutely indispensable. And when you are talking about prevention, the recommendation is that member states develop, in accordance with their constitution and legislative tradition, ensure independence of the media. Independence of the media, that's the key problem. It's the key question. We have to fight for independence of the media and its corollary, media pluralism. We had some cases at the court concerning media pluralism. Of course, I know it could be we have said that for years, but if we have said that for years, it means that maybe the message was not really understood. So we have to reinsist on that, independence and media pluralism. Another point on the prevention is to put member states, even to invite them, to encourage them, maybe to force them to put in place legislative framework that enable journalists and other media actors to contribute to public debate, because that's their function, effectively and without fear. Because when there is fear, you don't have free journalists anymore. And such a framework should guarantee public access to information, privacy and data protection, confidentiality, security of communication, protection, of course, of journalist sources, and whistleblowers. Of course, we had some cases at the court concerning protection of source and whistleblowers. Okay, but at the end, now what is important is to oblige member state to have this kind of provision in their legislative framework. Also, and that's maybe a little bit close to what you have said, or I don't know, but we try to put attention also, and due attention, to be paid to the importance of adequate labor and employment law to protect journalists. Because it's not only in the criminal sphere, but it's also in the civil sphere. That's also on the level of prevention. I can multiply because there are other things, but I just pinpoint these two: prevention, protection, and then prosecution. That's the 3 pillars. That's the 3 pillars. Prevention, protection, it means that during the work of the journalist, police protection, of course, when requested by journalists, that's absolutely indispensable in conflict zone, in a crisis, in many situations when there is really a need for police evacuation to a safe place, early warning, emergency contact point. So we can see in this recommendation many provisions concerning what we call a protection when there is a problem, when there is a situation. Deprivation of liberty, you will say it happens not so often. Yes, more than you think. Deprivation of liberty of journalists. And of course, deprivation of journalists, as they must absolutely receive adequate procedural guarantee, all the guarantee, but for normal citizens, but especially in this situation. And then also the last point, there are many others, I just choose some of them, pick and choose, it's a little bit arbitrary. Other measures to prevent use of law and legal process to intimidate and silence journalists. That's a very important point for me. it is so important that the state must take some measure in order to prevent that the use of the law and the legal process, it's a way of intimidating. Of course, what I'm thinking about is defamation. Defamation law should be repealed. Defamation law, because of course, and we had some cases on that, the parties are not on equal footing. Defamation law is so easy to lodge for a big company, and for the journalist, it's a disaster. So defamation law should be, all the legislation should repeal defamation law. Prosecution, that's quite easy when there is an injury, when there is a murder, of course, because of course there were murders. We're talking about 3 murders, but there are more than that. There are 3 in Russia now today. So this situation is completely alarming. So all the criminal law provision should, of course, be put in place and to be applied effectively. Alors, concerning the convention is Article 10. Article 10 of the convention, every person has the right to freedom of expression. It's a right. It's a right which is guaranteed by Article 10. And this right covers any speech, even the speech who shock, who disturb, or qui inquiète, to any person, of course, any form of speech, journalist, a poem, literature, everything. What is important for us is that Article 10 imposes to the state negative and positive obligation. Negative obligation means no censorship. No censorship, and there is many cases concerning that. It means state cannot interfere with freedom of expression. Negative obligation, but also positive obligation. And that's for me, it's not completely different. It's not enough to say, okay, I will do nothing to interfere. Okay, but to have also to adopt some positive measure in order to let freedom of expression to develop freely. And that's exactly, for instance, the case we have on the protection of source. Protection of source of journalists is a means absolutely necessary in order to have freedom of expression. Idem for whistleblowers. This case was so obvious for me. So obvious. If there is no protection of whistleblower, how can you have freedom of expression? So you have positive and negative obligation, and both of them are. And then that will be the last sorry. Of course, freedom of expression is not an absolute right. Absolute right is only right to life, prohibition of torture, legality, and slavery. All the other rights, we have to accept that in a democratic society, to have some interference, to have some exception. The principle is the freedom. The exception are the interference. And then the exception should be very strictly construed. Today, the problem of the court, and maybe in general as well, which are the limits of freedom of expression? Are there some limits? And the example today, or the situation today, which is difficult concerning that, is hate speech. Is hate speech acceptable under the freedom of expression? Where do we have to put the limits? My humble position is that freedom of expression should be developed to the end, le plus largement possible. For me, that's really in coherence with the philosophy of freedom of expression. The only point where we have to discuss when there is direct incitement to violence. That would be, then we can discuss. But all the rest. Voilà, sorry, I was a little bit longer than my 10 minutes, but when you ask me to speak about the convention, I can speak for hours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've got a couple of follow-up questions, but I want to make sure that we actually go to the audience. We have a microphone up here, and maybe I think what we should do is let's take, I don't know how many questions there will be, but let's maybe take 3 questions. If you can please give a question, if you can, a specific question, and direct it to someone specifically or to the whole panel, and try to keep it brief. So we'll do 3 at a time maybe, and then I'll let the panelists respond to the questions that are raised. So I think we have one here. Please introduce yourself, if it's possible.
Yes. Hello, my name is Flutu Rakusori. I work as a legal advisor at the European Center for Press and Media Freedom, based in Leipzig, in Germany. Thank you very much for this excellent panel. It's a very good way to spend and to mark a press freedom. I have two questions, if I may, very quick one. One is for Judge, from the former judge of the European Court of Human Rights. As you know, the European Court of Human Rights is very reluctant to decriminalize fully defamation. In 2004, they said that it's not acceptable except in some cases. But yet we don't have a case where it says that having criminal defamation is automatically a breach of Article 10. I would like to know from inside, why is it so difficult for judges to decriminalize defamation? The second question is for journalist Edward Perrin. After your experience with the legal aspect of the case, judiciary aspect of the case, what would be one or two advices for journalists who work with whistleblowers on how they should deal with whistleblowers? Especially from the perspective that as a journalist, you know that when you work with whistleblowers, there is a potential that you can endanger them. And I think it's the responsibility of journalists at least to inform the whistleblowers about potential risks. So if we can hear from you just one or two advices for other journalists working with whistleblowers. Thank you again.
Okay, I think we had one here, and there was another one up there. Yeah. Sorry I'll get you the other ones. You have one here? Thanks.
Yeah, my name is András László. I was born in Hungary. I was raised here. There's a French author, Paul Valéry, who wrote a fantastic text in 1919, The Crisis of the Human Spirit, La Crise de l'Esprit. Don't you think that, talking about this subject, that there's too much information in our society? People are overloaded with information. They're getting crazy in their head, they are getting crazy in their heart. And you said freedom of expression is a human right, but with all respect, everybody says everything, and lies are sold as truth, and vice versa. So my question to all of you, isn't it the time to silence a bit and to write a bit less instead of more?
Okay, and I think I saw, you next in the tie-up there.
Thank you for an excellent panel. My name is Marius Lukosiunas. I'm from UNESCO. I have a question to the last speaker. The Council of Europe has a convention on right to information, or freedom of information, which has been, the ratification process was quite difficult, I think. I think now it gathered enough signatures to be enacted. If you, madam, could elaborate a little bit on that, because from one hand we see that it took quite a bit of time for this convention to be ratified. From the other hand, we see that access to information is part of SDGs. You know, it's SDG 1610. It has been adopted by all UN community. The Open Government Partnership is another organization which has more like 80 members, including the governments who are very actively advocating for right to information and for access to information. So just if you could give us insight, what is the situation and why the Europe is the only place, I think, where you have convention on that issue. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. So I think we had one question for Edward, we had two for Francois, and sort of one for all the panelists generally. Maybe Edward, if you want to start with you, and ask the question about, answer the question about sort of advice for journalists working with whistleblowers.
Before answering the question, I mean, we should be really clear about what we are talking about. Whistleblowers are sources, but not all sources are whistleblowers. So we have to make sure, to make the utmost to protect the sources, whatever happens. when it comes to a person that is wishing to launch an alert about something, then of course the same precaution applies. I mean, when you communicate with that person, whether or not to meet him or her, the use of networks or not, that's the same set of standards. But for a whistleblower, then you should go a few steps ahead and consider what strategy. And then maybe it's not that much the role of a journalist, but yet it is the story that is going to impact the person launching the alert. And maybe the first duty as a reporter is let that person know that if she or he is really willing to do that, his or her life is going to be changed. That's for sure, because he's going to have a public recognition instantly, because he's going to be attacked, because his professional life or her professional life is going to absolutely change. So that's something that, and again, it's not the role of the reporter, but that should be said to the person. Again, I'm talking about whistleblower taking a public stand, not sources. That's one thing. Then there is the issue of how you as a reporter are using the evidences, and that's another very important aspect to it. Not only with whistleblowers, but all sources, and nearly every story is specifically and different from another. For instance, my two sources had different stories. One had already access and left the company with the document. The other was still in the company while claiming having access or having documents. So there are two different set of risks for person. Basically, for one, the risk was already taken. I mean, the day Antoine Deltour took all the documents in a few minutes, that was a big red flag for the forensic teams in the company when they investigated, which was very different from Raphael. And then, I mean, for that it's very different. And you should assess those differences case by case. I'm not sure if... okay.
Thanks. Françoise, do you want to
Yes,
answer the question?
yes, with pleasure. Alors, your first question concerning defamation. Thank you for this question, because for me it's very, very important. It's a good example that I realize that it's a good example of synergy, of necessity of synergy between the political aspect and the judicial one. Because that's why in the recommendation we put the emphasis on that, saying that if the country can repel this criminal offense from their legislation, that's where the problem lies. Alors, concerning the court, why the court didn't go so far as to say that defamation is against Article 10? For two reasons for me. First of all, because there is no consensus among member states, and you know how the European consensus is important for the court to enter into a new avenue. So the absence of consensus among member states is really one of the reasons why the court is a little bit, not reluctant, but frileuse, I don't know, how do you say that, I don't know. Merci beaucoup, cautious, it's a little bit cautious to go further in that. But you know, it's always the same with the court. If a new application arrives at the court and put exactly the good question, saying that the application of the defamation law in this situation, because we are facing a case, we are not facing a general principle, we are facing with a situation. If somebody, if an applicant lodges a complaint saying that in my case the defamation law has of an effect to have a disproportionate sentence, for instance, because that's of course the problem, then maybe the court could say, okay, in this situation, defamation law has this effect. Or, of course, it's disproportionate to have a sentence, and especially a criminal sentence, because we have a case law from 10 years now saying that except in exceptional circumstances, a criminal sanction is not appropriate for this kind of thing. And what I am completely convinced, coming from criminal law, I have a very for me, you have to use criminal law very cautiously because it's a very brutal, a very violent instrument, to be honest. So, you know, you have to turn around. So here you have to fight at the legislative level with recommendation, and I do hope that this recommendation could be implemented, and then the court could, through its own means, trying to but in very other situations, at the beginning, it's difficult, and then situation evolve with other argument, and at once, I should say the time is ripe. Is it okay to say that the time is ripe for a change? So, with the convent, with the human rights and the court, we have to be at the same time patient and impatient. Patient because it will take, but impatient because we have. Alors, your question, we write there's too much, people do write too much. Okay, maybe that's a question for all of us. I'm not sure because nobody is obliged to read. You are not obliged to read all these things. So you do exactly what you want. And freedom of expression is not only writing, it's also body language, it's also painting, it's also poetry. Freedom of expression is not only article or books. Maybe we are writing too much that I can accept. No, I don't know. No, I understand your question, but I didn't. Could you repeat Valéry quotation? Yes, Paul Valéry, I know, yes. 1919, yes. And what's the name of the text? Yes, but the name of the title of the text. La crise. Ah, yes, okay, yes. Okay, for tonight. But maybe so, okay. Alors, no, because freedom, I don't think in the sphere of journalists and media actors, all these people who are putting a vigorous and robust debate for question of general interest, I don't think they're writing too much or they're expressing too much. I think thanks to journalists, thanks to media, other media actors, now we are aware of situation we are really preoccupying without them. Oh. Yes. Yeah, yeah. I should say that's a philosophical question, yes.
Mary, I think you wanted to jump in.
It's funny because this thing about noise or about too much information. We have an editor who's based in Cairo. I can't share her name because it would put her and her family in danger. What happened in the Arab Spring, she said, is finally people were allowed the right to talk freely, and everyone started shouting at each other and shouting. And eventually the noise became so much that people decided that dictatorship was better. And I think that was a really poor decision. Because now you have a situation in Egypt where 500 people are being tried and sentenced, to death for imprisonment in 1 day, in 1 court, and in 1 hour. I think fatigue with noise, while I understand it, is incredibly dangerous because people come in and manipulate and exploit that fatigue. And I think you're absolutely right. It's not just articles, it's art, it's self-expression.
All form of expression.
You can switch it off. We need to get better at switching off and choosing. Do editors need to produce less and produce it better and make smart editorial decisions and choices? Yes, but I think that, do we have to become more creative and powerful and engaging in the way that we tell accurate stories? Yes, because at the moment there are tons of people out there, the current US administration included, that are very good at telling powerful, completely inaccurate stories. And we, the people who value truth and accuracy and transparency and accountability, need to get better at telling powerful stories and maybe telling fewer of them and telling them better, sure. But when I think of silence, I think of the instinct that happened in Egypt and other places, and I think of the disastrous effects of that. So I wanted to share that perspective from my colleague whose name I can't tell you.
Yeah, I think it's a great message for World Press Freedom Day.
Yeah,
if you want to.
So I think that it's better if you don't keep your mouth shut. But you can still have the right to select the news what you read. The problem is, in my view, is that the journalism is in a deep crisis, and the one reason of this crisis is here. The smartphone. So everybody can be a journalist. So everybody can produce news. And the question in 2018 is that how to bring the best possible truth to the people. So the question is not anymore how to bring the truth to the people, the best possible truth, and it makes a difference. And the second point is that this is the responsibility of the media and the responsibility of the society, that you have to educate people how to use these new devices and this new source of information. So how do you select what is real news and what is fake news? And you have to educate people, and you have to start this education from the childhood on.
May I just follow what you just have said? Because in Article 10 of the Convention is the only provision of the Convention in any other human rights treaty that the text is saying that freedom of expression implies rights and duties and responsibility. It doesn't mean that they are equivalent between right and duty. That's not my point, because I don't believe in that. But in this situation, it means that journalists, media actors have duties and responsibility, and duties exactly. So that's quite important, exactly in accord, following what you just have said, yeah.
Yeah, maybe we can take one or two more questions.
I didn't answer each question.
Let's have her ask her question, and then maybe we can take both at the same time. I think you had one, right?
I don't know if it's still there.
Oh, right here. Sorry.
I don't know if if it's right to steal time, because it's a little bit far away from the philosophical level of the debate, which is also extremely interesting. So maybe say we won't answer now. This question is a little bit technical, so it's addressed to Mrs. Tolkien. I'm from Slovakia, and as you know, there is in the last weeks and months quite unexpected huge outreach after the murder of a young journalist, Jan Kuciak.
Yeah.
And I wonder if there is a tool, because this whole civic movement is now at the stage where it's not just about demonstration in streets, but it's about finding. It's also a big intellectual challenge to find efficacy, to find efficient tools. And there was a moment in autumn last year when Jan Kuciak asked for protection, and he reported to the police, and he even recorded a phone call from a very influential person of the grey zone, very close to our government. He wrote about him, and this guy was threatening him, not by violence, not to kill him, but he was threatening. He told him, "I will go and find something about you, about your family, about your mother, about everything you do. And this is what I'm going to do." And he recorded this because he had contact already with him, and delivered this to the police. And for 44 days, nothing happened. And then the police considered it's not important, whatever. And is there a way how, on European level, the state could be forced to call the police cops to hold them accountable for this?
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course, I cannot. I just give you the main principle. When I was talking just a few minutes ago about a necessity of protection, that's exactly what you are quoting here. He called to the police, and the police didn't react for many, many reasons. We realize that in many countries, not only for journalists, with other vulnerable people, there is no reaction from the police for reasons which can be disputed. And here in this situation, if he warned the police long before the events that he was at risk, that he was threatened and so on, that's really a problem. That's really a problem as far as protection is concerned. Alors, concerning the human rights, if after having exhausted all domestic remedies, that's absolutely indispensable. We have to repeat that all the time. So he has to start, the family of has to start proceedings in Slovakia. That's absolutely, that's the philosophy of the court, because you cannot put a alleged violation of the convention to the court if you then haven't given the possibility of the domestic authority to find the violation and to repair, to repair. Okay. So, and if no success in Slovakia, and he lodged a complaint to the court, yes, because that's exactly a procedural obligation. If you have to protect life of people, you have also, and that's the obligation of the state, it's a positive obligation of the state to be sure that all the police and all the different authorities, the prosecution authority, fulfill adequately their function. If it's possible to prove that police, for any reasons, didn't take that seriously, it is quite a frivolous situation, eh bien, if it's proven, yes, that's exactly a procedural violation of Article 2. The states, it means the government, the state is obliged to examine seriously cases which are. So voilà, in a nutshell, what could be done? What could be done first to, of course, exhaust domestic remedy and to explain that there is a violation, an alleged violation of Article 2 because the victim was dead, because of the bad implementation of the criminal procedure and the criminal system. And for your questions...
sorry, maybe, I think, Edward, you wanted to comment on this?
No, I just wanted to add to that.
Pardon.
No, sorry. Recently, I'm not sure you heard about the Daphne Project, about, well, it's a colleague and friend of mine who had the idea, and I'm actually part of the organization that kind of nested the Forbidden Stories and the Daphne Project. And of course, one part of the Daphne Project, similar project that we could do later on, is unfortunately to keep on working on the stories of a killed reporter. The other part is as important. It's to, well, it intends to provide some kind of an insurance to a journalist that feels threatened, to make sure he or she uploads the information of the investigation where it is safe. And in case something happens, in case he's in trouble with the law, he's arrested or worse, killed, then make sure that it is known that his investigation will keep on. And that's, I hope, will be another tool and a powerful tool to deter harassment on journalists. Because if you know that you are going to have 45 reporters instead of one on the same story, maybe you are going to think differently about how you're going to attack journalists. So that maybe that's something that we should see.
One thing I just add to that, which is kind of the same point, is many of our contributors are from all over the world, and they say that publishing on open democracy or publishing on a global media platform, doesn't have to be open democracy, is a form of insurance in itself. Because if you're recognized in a global sphere, if your work is recognized above the national level, then you have extra insurance. If you're known as a contributor to a global organization in one way or another, that's another level of protection. It doesn't, it's obviously not a guarantee of protection, but it's another insurance policy, and it's something people tell us when they say that's the value for them of contributing to our platform, as well as reaching a larger audience.
Yeah, just in case anyone doesn't know, the Daphne Project was a coalition was founded by an organization called Forbidden Stories, and they basically put together a coalition of international media organizations to continue the work that Daphne Caruana was working on when she was killed. They went through files that she had left behind, and their whole purpose was to say, you can kill the journalist, but you can't kill the story. So it was a really amazing effort, I think, and I'm fortunate that it had to take place, but I think a great reaction. Maybe, Francois, if you just want to answer the very last question.
No, it was this question, because if I understood, I don't see you. Yes, if I understood you correctly, right to give information, right to receive information, that's your point. The other side.
I was asking a question about the Council of Europe.
Yeah, but about the Convention of the Council of Europe, unfortunately, I'm not part of it, so I know nothing from the inside, nothing. But as far as the court case law is concerned, we recognize in 2 or 3 not so recent cases the right to receive information. So I'm a little bit puzzled by the fact that you say that the convention is. I'm not aware of the convention. I'm sorry. I don't say there is a tight division between the court and the Council of Europe. There is a bridge between us, that's true. But, and so, no, I'm not aware of the discussion of the Council of Europe on this point. But I know that as far as the court is concerned, we recognize not only the right to give information, but also the right to have information, to receive information. That's, voilà.
Yeah. I'm afraid that we're going to have to stop, I think, because they need this room after this panel. But I think this was a really fascinating discussion, and I want to thank first all the panelists for taking the time here today, and of course the audience for coming and listening, participating. And yeah, a happy World Press Freedom Day to everyone, and hope you continue to think about these issues that we discussed today. Thanks very much.